Welcome back, everyone. Today we are stepping into a story that quite literally hurts to walk through, because sometimes the best way to understand the past is to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Imagine waking up in London in the late 1800s. The air is cold and damp. You can hear the sound of carriage wheels echoing through foggy streets. But before you step outside, you must complete one simple ritual that defines your class, your manners, even your worth. You must put on your shoes. They look elegant, polished, black leather, sharply pointed toes, delicate stitching that gleams faintly in the morning light. They match perfectly with your long dress or neatly pressed suit. But the moment you slide your foot inside, a quiet battle begins. The leather is stiff, the arch unforgiving, and your toes have nowhere to go. Because Victorian shoes were not designed for the human body, they were designed for society. In the 19th century, the world was transforming at a breathtaking pace. Industrial progress, social ambition, and a new obsession with appearances made fashion more than just clothing. It became a declaration of who you were. And in this polished age of manners and morality, even your shoes could determine your place in the world. Yet behind the beauty lay a hidden cost. Victorian footwear was crafted not to comfort but to control. For women, shoes meant narrow toes and high, rigid heels that made walking appear delicate, graceful, even fragile. For men, stiff leather boots signaled authority and success, though they bit into the ankles beneath. The message was clear: endure the discomfort. Pain was elegance, endurance was status, and restraint was a virtue. To be refined was to suffer gracefully. Now, imagine stepping outside onto the cobblestone streets. Horses trot past, children run to school, vendors shout about fresh bread, and with every step you feel a sharp pulse of pain shooting from your feet upward. The leather digs into your skin, your toes are cramped together like strangers forced to share a seat, and your heel rubs raw with each stride. Yet you keep walking. You must. To limp is to show weakness. To adjust your shoe in public is to reveal poor manners. So you keep your posture tall, your face composed, and you say nothing. That is what conformity looked like. Not grand speeches or written laws, but tiny, unspoken expectations that shaped every movement of daily life. In Victorian society, how you walked said as much as what you said. Your gait revealed your breeding, your worth, and your place in the invisible hierarchy of the city. Shoes were not simply accessories. They were silent instruments of control, ensuring that everyone walked in step, both literally and socially. The truth behind those elegant boots and button shoes runs deeper than fashion. It was built on the belief that beauty must hurt and that suffering proved character. The Victorians inherited this idea from centuries of moral strictness. The notion that physical discipline reflected spiritual strength. The body was to be shaped, not understood. Corsets restrained torsos. Shoes restrained movement. Together they molded posture, expression, and even personality. You were taught to stand tall, walk straight, and never complain. If you did, it was not the shoe's fault. It was your weakness. Over time, people learned to hide their pain as part of daily performance. A blister was not an injury, but an inconvenience. Swollen feet were a sign of refinement. Lace and silk concealed the damage beneath. Even in agony, one was expected to appear composed, graceful, proper. It is strange to think that pain became a kind of social badge, the price of elegance, quietly worn beneath layers of respectability. Cobblers and shoemakers only reinforced this illusion. Many refused to design shoes shaped differently for the left and right foot. One symmetrical mold saved time and money, but forced the body to adapt unnaturally. Feet twisted inward, bones deformed, joints stiffened, and yet this was accepted as normal. If everyone suffered, then suffering no longer seemed wrong. It simply became the standard. Comfortable shoes were dismissed as peasant-like. Wide toes were unladylike. A perfect gentleman's boot, etiquette books insisted, should never betray fatigue. Fashion demanded restraint, and the body was expected to obey. To choose comfort was to risk ridicule, even suspicion, because comfort suggested carelessness, a lack of ambition, a touch of rebellion. In that sense, Victorian shoes were more than garments. They were symbols of conformity, beautiful on the surface, rigid underneath, demanding perfection at any cost. Every walk through London became a performance of quiet endurance. The polished exterior of society hid an undercurrent of pain. Behind every poised step lay swollen arches and aching bones, carefully hidden beneath leather and lace. If you look closer, the shoe becomes a mirror of the age itself, refined, structured, disciplined, but deeply uncomfortable beneath the veneer of civility. It is a reminder that elegance in the Victorian world was not about ease or freedom. It was about control. Every step you took reinforced your role, your image, your obedience to the invisible rules that governed behavior and appearance alike. So when we say that Victorian shoes ruined people's feet, it is not just about fashion gone wrong. It is about a culture that prized beauty over well-being and conformity over comfort. It is about a world where pain was proof of virtue and where elegance meant erasing the body's natural needs. Before we move on, think about your own shoes, the ones you are wearing right now. Are they comfortable? Do they truly fit the rhythm of your life? Or do they, in some quiet way, represent the same idea that style matters more than comfort, that appearance must outweigh ease? The story of Victorian shoes is not only about the past, it is about how easily we learn to endure what hurts. Simply because the world tells us it is normal. It is about how pain can become invisible when everyone shares it. And it is about the quiet rebellion that begins the moment someone dares to ask, why must fashion hurt at all? As we continue, we will step deeper into the heart of this history, into the workshops, the factories, and the social circles that made pain fashionable and conformity beautiful. Because behind every shining pair of Victorian shoes, there is a story not just of elegance, but of endurance. The pain did not stop at the edge of the shoe. It became a performance, a daily rehearsal of discipline and restraint. Fashion in the Victorian world was not simply about looking beautiful. It was about proving that you could endure beauty. Every lace tightened, every seam pressed, every shoe squeezed was a silent declaration, I can bear it, and I will not complain. In an era obsessed with morality and reputation, the ability to suffer gracefully became a social currency. The more one could conceal discomfort, the higher they appeared in refinement. This idea extended beyond clothing. It was a moral philosophy stitched into the fabric of the century. Women were praised for patience and composure, men for stoic endurance. Pain was not something to be solved, but something to be managed with elegance. Society admired those who moved through the world untouched by hardship, or at least appeared that way. A lady with aching feet must glide as though walking on air. A gentleman with blistered heels must walk proudly, his boots gleaming like mirrors. Everyone understood the game. To flinch was to fail. To admit suffering was to expose vulnerability. The body had to be mastered, hidden behind a mask of grace. The fashion magazines of the time made this expectation explicit. They described shoes not in terms of comfort, but in terms of virtue. A narrow foot, one article proclaimed, is the mark of delicacy, refinement, and self-command. In that single line, the human body became a moral battlefield. Wide feet were not natural, they were uncontrolled, even vulgar. The ideal Victorian foot was small, constrained, obedient, just like the role women were expected to play in society. And yet, this silent suffering was admired. It carried the same weight as good manners or education. To endure was to belong, whether it was the corset pressing against the ribs, the starched collar scraping the neck, or the shoes that carved new shapes into one's bones. All were symbols of belonging to a world that valued control above comfort. There is a moment, perhaps, when this logic turns cruel. A young woman, standing before her mirror, tightens her boots even though they no longer fit. She can barely breathe as she fastens the final button. She tells herself, everyone else manages it. Her mother once said the same. Her friends will do it tomorrow. No one questions the ritual, because to suffer is to be respectable. The cycle repeats. Men, too, participated in this quiet endurance. The stiff military-style boots of the period became emblems of strength and discipline. To polish them daily, to bear the bruises they caused, was a form of masculine pride. A man who complained about sore feet would be mocked as weak, effeminate, or idle. So, like their female counterparts, they learned silence. Pain was private, appearance was public. Even medical advice reflected this cultural blindness. Doctors in London wrote about ladies' foot deformities with detached amusement, as though bunions and twisted toes were natural consequences of beauty, not preventable injuries. One 1870s physician remarked that tight shoes are to the feet what tight corsets are to the waist, an ornament that refines. No one stopped to ask why refinement required pain in the first place. The cruel irony is that the very discomfort people endured became a mark of superiority. The ability to tolerate suffering was transformed into a badge of character. The more pain you could hide, the more civilized you appeared. In this way, fashion became an invisible test of endurance, one that everyone took, and no one passed unscarred. And underneath it all there was fear. Fear of being judged, of standing out, of being seen as common or careless. A comfortable shoe might make you walk differently, move differently, and people noticed everything. Etiquette guides warned against improper steps and ungraceful stances, as if walking too freely could expose something indecent. Every gesture, every movement had to match the ideals of control, so people learned to turn their pain into poise. They developed a kind of elegance that was not effortless at all, but painfully earned. Every blister and bruise was proof that they had succeeded in hiding the struggle. Society applauded the result, not the cost. There is a certain tragedy in realizing that the culture of the time did not just accept pain, it romanticized it. The idea of suffering beautifully was woven into the Victorian imagination. Pain became art. Endurance became morality. And fashion, instead of celebrating life, became a quiet rehearsal for restraint. If we look closely, we can still feel echoes of that mindset today, in high heels that pinch, in dress codes that prioritize appearance over health, in the quiet pride people take in putting up with it. We may not wear corsets and pointed boots anymore, but the belief that beauty must hurt still walks among us. The Victorian world perfected that illusion, that grace is born from struggle, that elegance demands sacrifice. But behind the silk and shine, millions of ordinary people were left limping, their pain unseen, their humanity silenced. In the next part, we will descend even deeper into that reality, into the cobblers' workshops, where these instruments of elegance were forged. We will see how industrial progress and mass production did not bring relief, but instead spread the suffering further, turning personal pain into a global pattern of conformity. Industrial progress promised convenience and abundance, but in Victorian England, it also brought a quiet, universal ache that began right at the soles of people's feet. The shoe industry, once ruled by the skill of individual cobblers, was swallowed by the factories of the Industrial Revolution. What had once been handmade, measured, and adjusted to a person's step was now stamped, nailed, and assembled by machines. On paper, it sounded like progress, cheaper prices, faster production, wider availability. But behind the factory doors, efficiency came with a hidden price: individuality. The human foot is unique, each curve and angle shaped by movement, bone, and life itself. Yet factories had no time for uniqueness. They built shoes by the thousands, all identical, all symmetrical. Inside these sprawling buildings, workers, often women and children, stitched, hammered, and glued from dawn to dusk. The air was thick with the smell of leather, glue, and dust. Rows of half-finished shoes hung from hooks, swinging like pendulums above tired faces. Most of the workers did not even own a decent pair themselves. They stood for 12 hours a day on hard floors, wearing the same stiff, mass-made boots they produced. Their feet bled, their backs ached, and their wages barely covered rent. For the middle and upper classes, mass production meant that fashionable shoes were suddenly accessible in a way they would never been before. But accessibility did not mean comfort, it meant conformity. Everyone, rich or poor, now wore the same narrow shapes. It was a democratization of pain. The old cobblers who once measured each arch and crafted shoes that bent with the foot became relics of a vanishing craft. Many resisted the change, insisting that machine-made shoes would deform the human body. They were right, but their warnings were drowned out by the language of progress. Uniformity, industrialists claimed, is the price of civilization. The factories did not just change how shoes were made, they changed how people thought about them. Shoes became less a reflection of the individual and more a reflection of the system. Every pair that left the factory looked perfect, polished, symmetrical, and yet the moment they met a real foot, the illusion broke. The rigid form pressed against living flesh, demanding obedience. This mechanical precision created new hierarchies of suffering. The wealthy could afford softer leathers or imported designs, while the poor received the roughest versions, heavy, unyielding boots meant to last, not to comfort. Children in factories wore hand-me-downs from adults, stuffing paper into the toes to make them fit. Some developed infections from blisters that never healed. Others limped permanently by adolescence. The irony is cruel. Shoes were supposed to liberate people, allowing them to move farther and faster, but industrial shoes chained them differently to standardization, to expectation, to invisible pain. Think of the image of a Victorian street at noon. Businessmen in suits, women in long skirts, children running errands, factory girls rushing home. Beneath that image of motion lies a world of friction, sore heels, swollen joints, toenails bruised by tight leather, Everyone walks, but no one walks freely. Even the advertisements of the time betrayed the hypocrisy. Posters boasted of modern comfort, refined fit, and scientific shaping, yet these were marketing illusions, not medical truths. The scientific design referred to efficiency for production, not anatomy. Comfort was a word used to sell suffering in a more palatable way. Behind those glowing claims, another truth unfolded. Industrial capitalism did not just mass-produce shoes. It mass-produced the mindset that pain was acceptable if it served productivity or fashion. The same logic that fueled the factories also shaped the culture of the feet that wore their products. The worker with bleeding soles kept standing. A gentleman with blisters attended every dinner. A lady with swollen ankles kept dancing. Because in an age of rapid change, showing weakness was more frightening than the pain itself. And yet, there were quiet rebellions. Some reformers, doctors, educators, and even a few forward-thinking shoemakers began to question the consequences. They published pamphlets arguing for anatomical design, urging society to value health over appearance. They warned of long-term damage, bunions, joint deformities, collapsed arches. Their voices were small but persistent, echoing in the medical journals of the time. Still, progress moved faster than compassion. By the 1880s, factories in Northampton and Leicester could turn out thousands of pairs a week. Shoes became symbols of national pride, exported across the empire. Each shipment carried not just leather and nails, but an idea that uniformity was modern and comfort was old-fashioned. For the factory workers themselves, the irony deepened. They crafted beauty for others while standing in pain. At the end of the day, they went home barefoot or in torn boots, feet blistered and swollen. Their suffering was not just physical, it was symbolic. The living cost of industrial elegance. The factory floor became the new workshop of conformity, and the human body once again had to adapt to the machine. A cobbler once shaped shoes to fit a foot. Now the foot was forced to fit the shoe. The language of progress had turned upside down. By night, the streets filled with the sound of weary footsteps, a kind of mechanical rhythm that matched the ticking of the industrial age. Every step echoed the same contradiction, a world marching proudly forward but limping beneath its own weight. This was the paradox of Victorian modernity, that the very inventions meant to improve life often made it more uncomfortable. Shoes, once symbols of craftsmanship, became symbols of control. They taught people to walk in unison, to accept the standard, to silence their discomfort. And yet, beneath that silence, something was beginning to change. A few began to notice the connection between design and suffering, between fashion and health. The whispers of reform would soon grow louder, challenging the belief that elegance required pain. But before that quiet revolution could begin, the working classes would face one of the harshest realities of all, a world where even pain was a privilege, and those at the bottom did not have the luxury to complain. While the wealthy hobbled in polished boots and silk stockings, the poor endured something far worse. In the shadow of the same London streets where fine carriages rolled by, factory workers, servants, and laborers walked in shoes that were not just uncomfortable, they were weapons against their own survival. For the working class, shoes were not fashion. They were endurance tools. A single pair had to last through rain, mud, and years of walking. Many could not afford new ones at all. They bought second-hand boots from street vendors or pawn shops, sometimes with holes patched by bits of tin or cloth. Others tied their shoes together with rope or wire, desperate to keep them usable for one more week. A day in a Victorian factory began before sunrise. The air was cold and thick with soot, and the floors, stone or wood, offered no forgiveness. Most workers stood for 12, sometimes 14 hours. The shoes they wore had no cushioning, no lining, no fit. The leather was hard as bark, the soles thin as paper. By midday, every step sent a jolt of pain through the legs and spine. Women in textile mills or match factories often wrapped rags around their feet under their boots to soften the blisters. The rags, soaked with sweat and dust, became breeding grounds for infection. Doctors of the time noted cases of foot rot and ulcers spreading among factory laborers, but society saw it as a consequence of poverty, not of cruelty. Children suffered even more. Many worked barefoot in workshops or mines because their families could not afford shoes. In winter, frost-bitten toes turned black. Some lost nails permanently, others limped for life. When they did have shoes, they were often handed down from adults, too large to walk in properly, causing injuries that never healed. A journalist visiting the East End in the 1880s described seeing children with feet bandaged in paper or sackcloth, their soles worn thin as parchment. Meanwhile, the wealthy would discard their barely used boots for new designs every season. Ironically, those same discarded shoes often made their way back into the hands of the poor, resold at street markets in tattered condition. It was a quiet cycle of suffering the poor, literally walking in the cast-offs of the rich. In working-class districts, shoemakers were not artisans of luxury. They were repairers of survival. They stitched until their fingers bled, patching the same pair of boots again and again for customers who could never pay in full. Some were paid in bread, some in coal, some in promises. For women servants, the situation carried an added layer of humiliation. A lady's maid or housekeeper was expected to maintain a neat, modest appearance, even when her shoes were falling apart. Many polished the same cracked leather every morning, hoping no one would notice the holes in the soles. Some wore slippers indoors to hide the sound of their worn heels clicking on marble floors, because a servant was expected to move. Silently, the psychological toll was immense. The poor were reminded of their position with every step they took. Their shoes, stiff and broken, literally shaped the way they walked, small, cautious steps to avoid pain, to avoid drawing attention. Fashion had turned suffering into a virtue for the upper class. For the working class, it was a punishment they could never escape. When reformers and early social photographers began documenting the lives of London's poor in the late 19th century, the condition of people's feet became a symbol of inequality. Images showed barefoot children in the snow, cobblers asleep at their benches, women carrying shoes tied together around their necks because they could not risk wearing them out. These were not just images of poverty. They were portraits of endurance, of bodies forced to conform to a world built without compassion. The cruelty of the time lay not only in the physical suffering, but in the moral judgment attached to it. Society viewed worn shoes as a sign of laziness or failure, not of systemic injustice. A man limping to work was seen as clumsy, not exhausted. A child without shoes was undisciplined, not destitute. Pain was never a reason for empathy. It was a reason for shame. And yet, within that daily struggle, small moments of humanity persisted. Neighbors shared old boots. Mothers sewed cloth soles for their children, and cobblers quietly gave discounts to those who had nothing. Pain forged community. Suffering became a kind of shared language among the poor one that the wealthy could neither see nor understand. When the workday finally ended and the factories fell silent, the workers' boots told their stories better than words ever could. Cracked leather, uneven soles, bent nails, each mark a record of survival. They would take those boots off at night, set them beside the bed, and pray they would last one more day. It is almost poetic to think that something as ordinary as a shoe could divide an entire society, that leather and laces could represent privilege on one street and despair on the next. In the same city, one woman's polished boots announced refinement, while another's bleeding feet whispered endurance. Victorian society may have claimed progress, but for millions of people walking its streets, that progress never reached their souls. Industrialization had promised mobility, yet it chained them to endless labor, pain, and silence. And through it all, no one asked the simplest question, why must shoes hurt at all? But soon, that question would begin to echo louder in medical journals, in reform speeches, and in the hearts of people who had suffered long enough. A quiet rebellion was beginning to form, one that did not start with politics or protest, but with something as humble as a single, comfortable step. Change in Victorian society rarely came as a roar. It began as a whisper. In the world of fashion and footwear, rebellion did not start in grand speeches or public protests. It began quietly, in back rooms, in small shops, and in the private discomfort of those who finally dared to say, "This should not hurt." By the late 1800s, the cracks in the culture of suffering were beginning to show. Doctors, shoemakers, and reform-minded writers started questioning why pain was being romanticized. For the first time, people began to link chronic foot injuries to the social ideals of fashion. Medical journals described women unable to walk without crutches by middle age, and soldiers discharged from service due to permanent deformities caused by improper boots. These were not isolated cases. They were evidence of a society that had normalized harm in the name of elegance. In London, a few progressive shoemakers began to experiment with designs that followed the natural shape of the foot. They created wider toe boxes, softer soles, and, in a radical move, shoes with distinct left and right molds. At first, these anatomical shoes were mocked by the upper class as peasant-like or grotesque, but a handful of doctors, including orthopedic pioneers like Thomas Shapter and William Adams, began publicly supporting the idea, writing that the shape of the shoe should follow the form of the foot, not the foot be forced into the form of the shoe. The first wave of reformers often faced ridicule. Fashion magazines dismissed them as overreacting. Socialites rolled their eyes at the idea of comfort being refined. But the conversation had begun, and once spoken aloud, the truth could not be unlearned. Women, too, played a quiet but powerful role in this shift. Many had endured years of pain in silence, the constant ache of narrow boots and high heels, until they began speaking about it among themselves. Some seamstresses and domestic workers, tired of limping home each night, started wearing softer men's shoes when off duty. A few even removed their boots entirely during breaks, hiding their bare feet behind factory walls or kitchen doors. Those moments of relief, however small, were acts of defiance. In upper-class society, some women took the rebellion further. They began questioning the entire structure of fashion that demanded submission from corsets to shoes. The early feminist movement in Britain, though often focused on education and suffrage, also included calls for rational dress. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, declared that clothing should conform to health, comfort, and usefulness, not to deformity or disease. That single line challenged decades of moral and aesthetic tradition. Shoes became a quiet battlefield for these ideals. Pamphlets circulated showing diagrams of deformed feet, comparing them to the natural foot of a child. Reformers argued that society was literally reshaping human anatomy for the sake of appearances. It was a shocking revelation for a culture that prided itself on progress. Some doctors began fitting patients with custom health shoes wide, soft, breathable, and, most importantly, comfortable. They were plain and practical, often made of canvas or unpolished leather, and were worn mainly in private. To wear them in public was to risk judgment or even mockery. But a few brave women did it anyway. Walking down London streets in flat, wide shoes was not just a comfort choice. It was a statement of rebellion. The movement slowly gained traction. By the 1890s, advertisements for hygienic footwear began appearing in small health magazines. They promised relief from pain, improved posture, and natural grace. The term natural was the key word, a quiet rejection of the artificial beauty that had ruled the century. Still, the battle was far from won. For every reformer promoting comfort, there were 10 voices defending tradition. Pain had been woven into the social fabric for too long to be easily removed. Endurance, said one editorial, is the measure of refinement. But endurance was beginning to lose its charm. The rebellion also reached art and literature. Novelists and illustrators began portraying the hidden cost of fashion. In satirical magazines like Punch, cartoons showed women fainting or tripping over absurdly tight shoes, exposing the hypocrisy of elegance. Behind the humor was a deep critique that beauty, as defined by society, was both ridiculous and cruel. Meanwhile, in working-class neighborhoods, comfort became a matter not of rebellion, but of survival. As industrial injuries mounted, reformers pushed for better workplace footwear. Some charities began distributing soft boots to child laborers, citing health concerns. It was a small change, but it symbolized something greater, a recognition that the body deserved care, not punishment. At the same time, a cultural shift was taking place beneath the surface. The idea that pain equaled virtue began to erode. The emerging sciences of anatomy and hygiene emphasized that health was not weakness, but strength. Walking, once an act of endurance, began to be seen as something that should be pleasant. That word pleasant marked a turning point. For centuries, pleasure and virtue had been enemies. Now, in the last years of the Victorian era, they were slowly learning to coexist. People began to imagine a world where movement could be graceful and painless, where beauty did not demand sacrifice, where a walk through London could be something more than an exercise in endurance. It is easy to overlook how revolutionary that idea was. The act of putting on a comfortable shoe was, in a sense, an act of freedom. It said, "I choose to move naturally. I refuse to suffer for appearances." Each step in a wider shoe was a step away from the invisible chains of conformity that had defined the century. By the dawn of the 20th century, the quiet rebellion had spread far beyond the shoe. It had become part of a new cultural consciousness, one that valued the human body not as a thing to be disciplined, but as something to be respected. The age of fashioned pain was ending, and with it, an old belief was finally breaking apart. In this way, a simple object, a shoe, became a symbol of social evolution. It reminded people that progress was not just about invention or wealth, but about compassion, about asking, with sincerity and courage, must beauty hurt? And though the Victorian world would fade into history, that question would echo into the modern age, where high heels, tight clothes, and impossible standards still whisper the same demand for quiet endurance. The difference now is that we know we can choose differently. If you really want to understand Victorian society, do not start with its kings or queens start with its shoes. Because in the 19th century, footwear was not just about fashion or comfort. It was a symbol of where you stood in the world and how obediently you stayed there. Every sole told a story. A narrow, polished boot spoke of status, money, and restraint. A rough, cracked work boot whispered of labor, exhaustion, and silence. Shoes were social signifiers, silent badges of identity that revealed everything without saying a word. They divided people just as effectively as language, accent, or address. In an age obsessed with order and hierarchy, shoes became one of the most subtle tools of control. For the wealthy, they were emblems of refinement. For the poor, they were reminders of confinement. Fashion dictated not only what people wore, but how they moved, how they stood, and even how they felt about themselves. Victorian culture believed that the body should always reflect morality. To be well dressed was to be virtuous. To appear disheveled was to be morally suspect. Shoes played a key role in this moral theater. A woman's perfectly buttoned boots suggested discipline and modesty. A man's well-polished pair implied respectability and hard work. In truth, they were often prisons of leather, but to society's eye, they were proof of virtue. For women, the control went deeper. Shoes were designed to limit freedom of movement. Narrow, high-heeled, and stiff, they shortened the stride, forcing smaller, slower steps that appeared ladylike. A woman who moved too freely risked being seen as improper or rebellious. Fashion literally shaped behavior. A restricted gait symbolized obedience, modesty, and elegance, all traits demanded by a patriarchal world. In this sense, the shoe was not just clothing. It was a mechanism of control. It turned grace into discipline, and discipline into submission. To walk in pain was to embody the values of your gender and class, to prove you could endure quietly, without complaint. Men's shoes, while less physically restrictive, carried their own burden of symbolism. They had to be firm, structured, and impeccably shined the image of composure and self-mastery. A man's worth was reflected in how confidently his boots struck the ground. Even among men, hierarchy was visible in the feet. A factory worker's boots covered in soot, a banker's shoes gleaming beneath his desk. Both walked on the same streets, yet lived in different worlds. The irony was cruel. Those who stood all day wore the worst shoes, while those who hardly walked had the finest. Comfort belonged to those who did not need it. The church, too, reinforced these ideas. Sermons often linked outward appearance to inner morality. A well-kept household and clean shoes were signs of godliness. In some parishes, the poor were shamed for showing up barefoot, as if poverty itself were a moral failure. Footwear became a symbol not just of status, but of spiritual worth. Even the laws reflected this unspoken hierarchy. In certain towns, servants were forbidden from wearing the same styles as their employers. A coachman or maid caught imitating their master's fashion could be dismissed. Clothing, and especially shoes, marked one's place in the social order as surely as any title or rank. This control extended into education and upbringing. Middle-class parents taught their children to walk properly, toes pointed inward, steps measured, heels aligned. A proper walk meant social success. An ungraceful gait could doom a young woman's chances at marriage, or a young man's hopes of promotion. Shoes, therefore, were not simply worn, they were learned. They shaped posture, behavior, and even ambition. In this light, the Victorian shoe becomes something almost sinister, a quiet enforcer of cultural discipline, every pinch of leather, every restricted step, reminded people of their place. The pain was not accidental. It was instructional. It taught obedience. But the cruel genius of it all was that people embraced it willingly. They believed in the system that hurt them. To wear comfortable shoes was to risk ridicule. To wear painful ones was to earn admiration. Society did not need to punish the body when it could persuade the body to punish itself. Women's magazines praised the elegance of delicate feet. Men's etiquette guides warned against loose, slovenly footwear. Every article, every drawing, every store window reinforced the same message. Pain was discipline, discipline was beauty, and beauty was moral order. And yet, beneath the surface, these very symbols of control revealed their weakness. Every time a woman loosened her laces at night, every time a man sighed in relief after removing his boots, a small truth emerged. The system was not natural. The body never truly submitted. It endured. It adapted. But it never forgot what comfort felt like. That resistance was quiet, but persistent. It lived in the sigh of relief when shoes came off, in the bare footprints left in garden soil, in the whispered conversations between servants who dared to walk barefoot after dark. The body, even when disciplined, remembered freedom. The class system tried to divide people, but pain united them. Across all levels of society, everyone, rich or poor, male or female, shared the same nightly ritual, taking off their shoes and feeling, if only for a moment, what it meant to be human again. Perhaps that is why reformers saw the shoe as a symbol worth fighting over. It was not just about health or comfort. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming the body from the weight of tradition and expectation. By the late Victorian era, that realization had begun to take root. People started to see the irony of a civilization that invented railways and telegraphs, yet could not design a shoe that did not cause pain. The question spread from workshops to drawing rooms, from women's clubs to medical schools. If we can transform the world, why can't we transform the way we walk in it? That question marked the beginning of a deeper awakening, one that connected comfort with equality and movement with freedom. The idea that shoes could liberate rather than control would soon change not only how people dressed, but how they saw themselves in society. By the final decades of the Victorian era, something remarkable began to stir beneath the surface of all that polished elegance and rigid decorum. People were starting to wake up, not all at once, and not loudly, but gradually, step by step. The realization was simple yet revolutionary. The way we walk shapes the way we live. After generations of obedience to fashion's tyranny, individuals began to rediscover what it felt like to move freely. The first sign of liberation was not political or social, it was physical. It began in the smallest gesture, loosening a shoelace, removing a heel, or choosing a wider pair despite the disapproving glances of others. Doctors, artists, and reformers played a quiet role in this awakening. Medical professionals, observing decades of deformities, began publishing pamphlets showing the damage caused by fashionable shoes, dislocated toes, collapsed arches, and chronic joint pain. These reports were not just medical, they were moral awakenings. They exposed the hidden cost of refinement and forced people to question whether beauty truly required pain. Some writers even romanticized bare feet as symbols of innocence and authenticity. Poets and painters began to depict peasants and children walking barefoot in meadows, images that contrasted sharply with the restrained, corseted figures of high society. The idea that natural movement could be beautiful began to challenge centuries of repression. By the 1890s, health walks had become a social trend among the educated class. People were encouraged to spend time outdoors, to breathe fresh air, to move naturally. Footwear reformers seized the moment, promoting shoes that followed the contours of the human foot instead of forcing the foot into submission. Wide toes, flexible soles, and breathable materials were no longer marks of poverty. They were signs of intelligence, progress, and care for one's well-being. For women, this change carried a deeper meaning. To walk freely was to exist freely. Comfortable shoes became quiet symbols of independence. Some suffragists, rejecting the fashion that had long restricted them, began to appear in practical boots during marches and meetings. Each stride became an act of defiance, a way of saying, "I will move as I please." Even in literature, the theme of walking gained new significance. Characters who wandered the countryside, unbound by formality, symbolized self-discovery and freedom. The act of walking, once an exercise in social performance, was slowly being reclaimed as an expression of individuality. At the same time, manufacturers sensed the cultural shift. New companies began advertising footwear not as an emblem of class, but as a tool for health. The language changed. Anatomical, flexible, supportive. It was the birth of the modern concept of comfort, something that would later define the 20th century. But this liberation was not just about shoes. It was about identity. For the first time, people realized that they did not have to shape themselves to fit society. They could shape society to fit them. The body, once a silent servant to custom, was reclaiming its right to feel. Imagine a woman standing by her window in 1898. She looks down at two pairs of shoes, one narrow and elegant, the other plain but soft. For a moment she hesitates. The old world whispers, "Choose beauty." But something in her, something tired of silence, whispers back, "Choose peace." She takes the softer pair, slips them on, then walks outside. Her stride is different, longer, freer, lighter. The world has not changed, but she has. Every small act of comfort was a rebellion against centuries of conditioning. Walking without pain became a metaphor for thinking without fear. Each person who chose comfort over convention was, in their own quiet way, reshaping the culture around them. Men, too, began to question their own burdens. The rigid, high-shined boots that once symbolized dignity were now viewed by some as relics of a repressive past. Gentlemen on the continent adopted softer shoes for travel and leisure, calling them rational walking boots. The ability to move comfortably through the world became a sign of confidence, not weakness. This transformation also carried an emotional dimension. When people stopped treating pain as a virtue, they began to view kindness toward themselves and others as strength. The body was no longer an enemy to be conquered, but a companion to be cared for. That shift in thinking rippled outward, influencing fashion, health, and even psychology in the early 20th century. By the dawn of the Edwardian age, comfort was no longer a shameful indulgence. It was becoming a mark of progress. Walking clubs formed across Britain, encouraging people to explore nature, to breathe, to move. Shoes were advertised with phrases like "freedom in every step" and "made for the human foot." What had once been mocked as radical was now fashionable. And yet, this was not just about shoes. It was about reclaiming humanity. Every reform, every change, began from the same core truth. People were tired of hurting for appearances. They wanted to feel alive, not confined. The liberation of the foot symbolized something larger, the liberation of self. When people learned to walk naturally again, They rediscovered more than comfort. They rediscovered agency. The freedom to choose how one walks, dresses, and moves became the foundation of a broader social awakening. The Victorian world had taught generations to hide pain beneath polish, to sacrifice the body for the sake of image. But by the century's end, the tide was turning. The body, once suppressed, was beginning to speak again through each natural step, each unforced breath, each quiet refusal to conform. It is poetic, really, that something as simple as a shoe could become the symbol of so much change. From silence to self-awareness, from obedience to expression, the path to liberation was walked one aching footstep at a time. And though the leather was still stiff and the streets still cold, the walkers of this new age carried something. The Victorians had nearly lost the memory of what freedom feels like. At the turn of the 20th century, the world stood on the edge of transformation. Steam engines roared, telegraphs clicked, and the rhythm of modern life quickened. But so did the rhythm of human understanding. After centuries of equating refinement with restraint, society began to ask a revolutionary question. What if beauty could be kind? This was not a loud revolution. It did not come with banners or protests, but it quietly rewrote the definition of elegance. For the first time in history, comfort began to carry dignity. The old equation pain equals virtue was losing its power. People started realizing that grace did not come from suffering. It came from ease, from the natural harmony between the body and the self. The change was subtle but everywhere. In advertisements, shoes once described as narrow and refined were now marketed as healthy and balanced. Words like natural fit, supportive arch, and flexible sole entered the public vocabulary. These were not just marketing terms. They reflected a cultural shift, a recognition that progress was not about controlling the body, but understanding it. Fashion, too, began to soften. Corsets loosened, fabrics breathed, and silhouettes relaxed. Walking, once a delicate performance of composure, became an act of vitality. The new woman, as newspapers called her, walked with purpose. Her shoes were practical, her steps confident. She represented a new ideal, not fragile and silent, but strong and free. For men, the change carried a different but equally powerful symbolism. The industrial age had demanded discipline and stoicism. Now, modernity asked for empathy and adaptability. The polished rigidity of Victorian masculinity gave way to something more human. A man could be respectable and still value comfort. The shine of his boots mattered less than the strength of his stride. Doctors began to emphasize posture and movement as foundations of health. Physical education appeared in schools. Walking became part of urban life rather than a privilege of leisure. The act of moving one's body without pain, without restriction, became a statement of modern humanity. But the most profound transformation was psychological. The old Victorian ideal had taught people to distrust pleasure, to see it as weakness, indulgence, even sin. Now, pleasure was being redefined. Comfort was no longer immoral, it was intelligent. To care for the body was to care for the self. The notion that self-respect could exist without self-punishment was quietly reshaping the Western mind. In literature and art, this shift was reflected everywhere. Pain was no longer glorified, it was questioned. Authors like George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde mocked the absurdity of fashion that hurt the wearer. Pain, once aestheticized, became a symbol of ignorance. Beauty, they argued, was not in control, but in authenticity. A new generation of designers emerged, Influenced by this philosophy, instead of seeing the body as something to be molded, they sought to collaborate with it. Function became the foundation of form. The human foot, once forced into submission, became the blueprint for modern design. It was an artistic as well as a moral evolution, the acknowledgement that truth and comfort could coexist. And yet this transformation did not erase history. It absorbed it. People carried the memory of their suffering like a cautionary tale. The twisted toes and scarred heels of the past were reminders of what happens when society values appearances more than empathy. This awareness created a new kind of wisdom, the understanding that beauty without compassion is simply cruelty disguised. As cities modernized, the idea of movement itself became democratic. Public parks, walking trails, and paved sidewalks invited everyone, not just the privileged, to move freely. The ability to walk comfortably was no longer a sign of class. It was a basic right of being human. The shoe, that small piece of civilization, became a symbol of equality. The cultural vocabulary of success changed too. In the Victorian age, success was measured by control of posture, voice, behavior, even emotion. Now success began to mean freedom, the ability to move, to choose, to live without constraint. A person who walked comfortably through the world embodied not idleness but confidence. Comfort became the new refinement. This shift did not happen overnight. The ghosts of the past lingered, the silent pride in endurance, the admiration for effortless pain. But the foundation had changed. The next generation grew up believing that beauty and health could live side by side, that kindness, even toward one's own body, was not weakness but wisdom. The early 20th century saw this philosophy spread across continents. Shoe companies in England, Germany, and America began investing in anatomical research. They studied how people walked, how weight shifted, how arches supported the spine. Science entered the conversation that fashion had long dominated. For the first time, the human body was not the problem. It was the inspiration. Behind every innovation was a quiet act of redemption. Each soft sole and ergonomic curve was an apology to the feet that had suffered for centuries. And with every comfortable step, people reclaimed something essential, the right to feel good in their own skin. By the 1910s, the change was visible on the streets. The sharp clicks of pain had softened into the steady rhythm of ease. The world was walking differently, slower, lighter, freer. Shoes no longer dictated identity. They served it. And this change did not just alter fashion. It reshaped the human relationship with progress itself. Comfort and compassion, once dismissed as sentimental, became the cornerstones of a more humane civilization. The measure of advancement was no longer how much pain people could endure, but how much unnecessary pain they could remove. It is easy to take this shift for granted today. We slip into sneakers, sandals, and soft-soled shoes without thinking about the centuries of suffering that came before. But every step we take without pain is a legacy of those who questioned the old world, those who dared to say that elegance should not hurt and that humanity must always come before vanity. The cultural redefinition of beauty and success began with something simple: compassion, first for the foot, then for the body, and eventually for the self. And in that compassion, humanity took its first comfortable step into the modern age. For centuries, pain had been a badge of honor, a quiet signal of refinement, of self-control, of belonging to the world of manners and civility. But as the 20th century dawned, that unspoken rule began to collapse. The very thing that once defined class, the ability to suffer beautifully, was starting to look absurd. The Industrial Revolution, which had first created mass suffering, now began to democratize comfort. Machines that once stamped out identical, rigid shoes were retooled to produce softer, better-fitted footwear for everyone. What had been a luxury for the few became a possibility for the many. Comfort once mocked as vulgar was becoming fashionable. The old social language written in leather and laces began to fade. You could no longer judge a person's worth by the shape of their shoes or the smoothness of their gait. Working people, clerks, teachers, and even factory laborers began wearing styles that had once been reserved for the upper class, not to imitate elegance, but to experience relief. The cultural meaning of shoes was changing. They were no longer instruments of separation. They were symbols of shared humanity. The same basic designs appeared across all levels of society: strong soles, flexible material, rounded toes. What mattered was not how painful they looked, but how freely they allowed one to move. This shift did not happen in a vacuum. It reflected a broader transformation in how people understood dignity. For much of history, suffering had been tied to virtue. The poor were expected to accept pain humbly. The rich were expected to endure it gracefully. But when comfort became accessible, that moral hierarchy collapsed. People realized that relief from pain was not indulgence. It was justice. Newspaper columns and medical journals began to discuss the right to health, a radical phrase at the time. Workers' movements demanded not only fair wages and safe conditions, but also proper footwear. Factory owners who once ignored complaints about sore feet now faced pressure to supply health-approved boots. In schools, children were finally fitted with shoes suited to their growing feet. Comfort was no longer a privilege. It was becoming a social responsibility. Fashion houses caught on quickly. What began as a quiet reform turned into a style revolution. Practical shoes, once considered plain, were redesigned with elegance and detail. Designers discovered that beauty and comfort could coexist, that a well-made shoe did not have to hurt to make a statement. By combining craftsmanship with empathy, they created something entirely new: fashion with conscience. Women in particular embraced this change as part of their growing independence. The suffrage movement had already challenged society's expectations of silence and restraint. Now it challenged the bodies as well. The act of walking freely, without the pinch of pain, became an assertion of equality. To walk comfortably was to declare, "I belong anywhere I choose to go." Men's fashion followed suit. The old stiffness of Victorian boots softened into flexibility. Loafers, walking shoes, and low-heeled Oxfords became symbols of modern sophistication. The new gentleman was not one who suffered quietly, but one who moved easily, confident, unburdened, alive. Even the language of advertisements changed. Where 19th century posters had praised refinement through narrowness, 20th century ads spoke of freedom, mobility, and natural comfort. The words that once justified suffering were being rewritten into an invitation to live better. By the 1920s, the distinction between fashionable and functional was blurring. Shoes became tools of expression rather than instruments of suppression. A teacher, a tailor, and a duchess could all wear similar designs and walk the same streets without social scandal. For the first time, the human experience of walking something so basic, so universal, began to unite people rather than divide them. The symbolic power of this change can't be overstated. In the Victorian world, pain was proof that you belonged to civilization. Now, comfort became proof that civilization had evolved. The right to move without agony was not merely physical. It was moral, emotional, even political. In working-class neighborhoods, the shift was most visible. Where once children limped through mud in broken boots, now they ran shod in affordable, durable shoes made for real feet. For mothers who had watched generations suffer, this was not just a convenience, it was redemption. For the first time, their children could walk to school without wincing, and in that simple act, a child walking comfortably to school, centuries of hierarchy quietly unraveled. No one watching that child could tell whether their parents were wealthy or poor. The old social code of pain had been erased, replaced by something simpler, kinder, and infinitely more human, movement without fear. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. Traditionalists scoffed, insisting that too much ease would make people lazy. To them, the decline of discomfort symbolized moral decay. But history was no longer on their side. The world was changing too quickly. Modern life demanded mobility, energy, and adaptability, and none of those could coexist with pain. As comfort spread, it did not cheapen society's sense of beauty, it deepened it. People began to see elegance not as restriction, but as balance. A well-made shoe was not beautiful because it hurt. It was beautiful because it harmonized with the person wearing it. By the 1930s, the idea that pain could ever define class or virtue had vanished. The social codes of the shoe had been rewritten. The same culture that once worshipped discipline now celebrated well-being. The same civilization that once admired endurance now valued compassion. And yet, the memory of what came before remained in museums, in preserved leather shoes with impossibly narrow tips, in the photographs of solemn faces forced into silent grace. They serve as reminders that progress is not always measured by grand inventions, but sometimes by the smallest victories. Like learning that it is possible to walk without pain and that no one deserves to suffer to be seen. In the end, the fading of pain as a class marker was not just about fashion. It was about equality, a shift from separation to solidarity, from endurance to empathy. The right to comfort became a shared language of humanity, one step at a time. Shoes have always been more than mere objects. They are mirrors of civilization itself. They trace the journey of humanity from survival to self-expression, from conformity to individuality. And in the story of Victorian footwear, we find one of the most revealing metaphors for what it means to be human, the constant struggle between restraint and release. When you think about it, shoes are paradoxical things. They exist to protect us, yet they can imprison us. They help us move, yet they can make movement painful. They express identity, yet they can erase individuality. Across cultures and centuries, shoes have symbolized both power and humility, both progress and control. In the Victorian era, that paradox became painfully literal. Shoes were not designed for the body. The body was forced to obey the shoe. They represented a society obsessed with appearances, a world that measured virtue through discomfort, elegance through endurance. Every pointed toe and polished heel carried a silent message. To belong, you must constrain yourself. But the deeper tragedy was not the physical pain. It was the spiritual one. By shaping the foot, society was shaping the soul. The narrow shoe became a symbol of conformity, of dreams compressed, and individuality folded inward. It was a quiet lesson learned. With every aching step, do not walk your own way. Walk the way you are told. And yet, within that same symbol, lay the seeds of rebellion. For when people began to question their shoes, they began to question everything else. The moment someone asked, "Why must it hurt to be beautiful?" they were also asking, "Why must it hurt to belong?" The Victorian shoe thus became a metaphor for awakening, the first realization that freedom begins with the body. The act of removing one's shoes at the end of the day, that sigh of relief, that small return to the self, was almost sacred. It was the moment when the mask fell away, when pretense dissolved, and the body finally spoke again. In that intimate gesture lay a quiet truth. No matter how rigid society becomes, the body remembers what freedom feels like. This metaphor has never left us. In every age, new shoes have replaced old ones, new expectations, new forms of conformity. But the question remains the same. How much pain are we willing to accept to fit in? Whether it is the tight dress code of an office, the impossible standards of social media, or the quiet pressure to appear perfect, the spirit of the Victorian shoe still lingers. It reminds us that progress is not just about invention, it is about liberation, the ability to move freely without apology. The evolution of the shoe reflects the evolution of the self. When shoes became softer, wider, and kinder, so did the human mind. Society began to see that true refinement was not the ability to endure pain, but the wisdom to prevent it. Compassion replaced cruelty as the new mark of civilization. Artists and philosophers later seized upon the metaphor of the shoe to explore deeper human truths. In literature, shoes became symbols of destiny, the journey one takes, the burdens one carries, the paths one dares to walk. In psychology, they came to represent identity, how we walk through life, what paths we choose, how comfortable we are in our own skin. The simple question, do these shoes fit, evolved into something larger. Does this life fit me? That question captures the essence of freedom, because comfort is not laziness, it is alignment. When something fits, you move without friction. When it does not, every step becomes resistance. The Victorians accepted resistance as elegance. Modernity learned that harmony is stronger than struggle. Shoes also reflect power dynamics. Throughout history, those with power have walked in comfort, while those without have walked in pain. The emancipation of the foot mirrored the emancipation of the worker, the woman, and the self. To claim comfort was to claim worth. To walk without pain was to reject invisibility. Even the imagery of shoes, their presence or absence, carries meaning. Barefoot children once symbolized poverty. Later, they came to symbolize innocence, freedom, the purity of nature untouched by artificial constraint. The evolution of that symbolism tells us something vital. Society's moral compass shifts as it learns to see empathy as beauty. In this sense, the story of Victorian shoes is not about fashion at all. It is about the long, slow awakening of empathy. The realization that progress cannot be measured by how much we can endure, but by how gently we can walk through the world. Look down at your own shoes for a moment. They carry your entire life, your memories, your choices, your daily journeys. Each scuff is a story, each worn sole a reminder that you have moved, persisted, lived. And if they are comfortable, if they let you move freely, then you are standing on centuries of quiet rebellion, the legacy of countless unnamed feet that refused to suffer silently. In the end, shoes remind us of one timeless truth: freedom is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent, humble, found in the space between leather and skin. It is in the way you walk, unhurried, unashamed, unbound. Victorians believed that beauty required pain. We have learned that beauty requires peace. Their world asked people to prove their worth by enduring. Ours asks us to honor our worth by feeling. That is the real evolution, not of footwear, but of humanity. Because every civilization, at its core, must decide one thing. Will it teach its people to walk in pain or to walk in kindness? The story of the shoe shows how one small object, worn, humble, ordinary, can answer that question with every step we take. When we look back at the Victorian world, it is easy to see its fashion as something quaint corsets, top hats, polished boots, and parasols. But beneath the surface, these were not just styles. They were systems. They reflected how people thought, how they lived, how they judged, and how they obeyed. And if we look closely, we will see something uncomfortable. Those systems never truly disappeared. They only changed shape. The Victorian shoe, with all its elegance and cruelty, is not just an artifact of the past. It is a mirror held up to our present, because even today we still build worlds where people are expected to endure discomfort quietly, not with leather and laces, but with expectations, appearances, and pressure. Think about it. We live in a society that tells us to push through, to smile even when we are hurting, to fit into molds that do not quite match who we are. We still value performance over peace, perfection over presence. The tools have changed, but the message feels familiar. Hide the pain. Look refined. Move gracefully through pressure. That is the modern shoe invisible, but no less binding. It might not blister the skin, but it squeezes the spirit. And so, the story of Victorian footwear becomes something more than history. It becomes a lesson in self-awareness. It reminds us how easy it is for culture to normalize pain, and how hard it can be to see that normalization until someone dares to question it. The Victorians did not think of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as proper, elegant, respectable. It took courage and imagination to ask, what if there is a better way to walk through life? That question remains just as vital today. It applies not only to fashion, but to everything, to work, relationships, ambition, and identity. We are still learning to distinguish between what truly fits us and what we have been told should fit. The deeper lesson is about empathy. The evolution from painful shoes to comfortable ones was not just a design improvement, it was a moral awakening. It showed that compassion could be practical, that kindness could exist in something as ordinary as a shoe. When people realized that beauty did not need to hurt, they did not just redesign fashion, they redesigned values. And maybe that is what progress really is, the gradual replacement of unnecessary pain with understanding. In every era, humanity repeats this cycle. We build systems that seem normal until one day someone points out that they hurt. Then we evolve, not just technologically, but emotionally. Shoes were once symbols of social control. Now they symbolize freedom. Corsets once signified discipline. Now we value breath. And each time we learn this lesson, we move a little closer to grace, not the artificial grace of posture and poise, but the natural grace of comfort and authenticity. But we should not forget how fragile that progress is, because the same forces that once made pain fashionable can always return, disguised in new forms, fast fashion that sacrifices laborers, beauty ideals that demand self-denial, lifestyles that glorify exhaustion. Each one is a modern echo of the Victorian shoe, something that looks impressive from the outside but quietly damages the person within. To reflect on the past is to guard against repetition. The Victorians believed they were at the peak of civilization, yet they built a world that literally deformed its own people in pursuit of beauty. The danger of pride lies in thinking we are beyond such blindness. So perhaps the real legacy of that era is not the shoe itself, but the awakening. It inspired the idea that we must always question what we accept as normal, because progress does not begin with invention. It begins with discomfort the moment someone realizes this should not hurt. Imagine walking through life barefoot for a moment, feeling the ground, the texture, the balance of your body. There is vulnerability in that image, but also honesty. Without the armor of fashion, we return to something real: connection, sensitivity, truth. The more we understand how we have hidden pain behind appearances, the closer we come to genuine freedom. Every generation needs that awakening. Every era must face its own version of the Victorian shoe, that one elegant lie we all agree to live with, until someone finally says, enough. The story of Victorian shoes teaches us that change begins at the smallest level, not in grand speeches or revolutions, but in the courage to choose comfort, compassion, and self-respect over conformity. It begins with noticing when something hurts and believing you deserve better. And that is the most timeless lesson of all. Pain may be inevitable, but unnecessary pain, the kind we wear for acceptance, is not. Once we learn to reject it, we do not just free our feet, we free our lives. When you think about it, every comfortable step you take today, every sneaker, every soft sole, every natural stride carries the memory of those who could not walk without pain and the triumph of those who dared to change that. The ground beneath us remembers. So, as we move forward into our own age of invention and pressure, perhaps we should ask ourselves one simple question, the same one that freed the Victorians from their narrow shoes. Are we still suffering for the sake of appearances, or are we finally learning to walk in peace? Because in that answer, quiet, personal, and profound, lies the true measure of how far we have come. So now, as our long walk through history reaches its end, we can finally look down not just at the shoes of the Victorians, but at our own, and see how far humanity has come. What began as a simple tale of leather, laces, and pain has revealed something much deeper, the story of how we learn, slowly and painfully, to treat ourselves and others with kindness. Victorian shoes were never just about fashion. They were a reflection of a belief that beauty required sacrifice. That dignity was measured by how quietly one could endure. In their polished leather, we see a civilization obsessed with control over the body, over emotion, over individuality. They turned elegance into obedience, and pain into proof of worth. But history is never static. The same objects that once symbolized confinement eventually became emblems of liberation. As people began to reject discomfort, they were not just changing footwear, they were rewriting the relationship between appearance and identity, between self and society. That is the first great lesson of this story. Progress does not always look like revolution. Sometimes it looks like relief. It happens not in parliaments or palaces, but in the quiet, everyday moments, when someone decides they have had enough of hurting, enough of pretending, enough of obeying rules that make no sense. Every cultural shift begins with that quiet act of refusal. The second lesson is empathy. The transition from pain to comfort was not only technological, it was moral. It required a new way of thinking, that suffering is not noble, that endurance is not beauty, and that kindness, even something as humble as designing a shoe that does not wound, is a mark of civilization. When we learn to build shoes that fit the foot, we were also learning to build societies that fit the human spirit. The idea that something should serve us, not suppress us, became the foundation of modern humanism. And the third lesson, perhaps the most personal, is freedom not the loud kind, won by wars or declared in documents, but the quiet freedom of simply existing without pain, to move without restriction, to walk in one's own rhythm, one's own path, one's own truth. The Victorians mistook stillness for grace. They believed control was beauty. We have learned that movement is life, and that beauty comes from balance between strength and softness, between expression and ease. Look at how that lesson echoes through everything we create now. Ergonomic design, breathable fabric, flexible technology, compassionate workplaces, mental health awareness. Each one is an extension of the same truth that progress means removing unnecessary pain. That civilization, at its best, is simply the art of making life gentler. When you put on a comfortable pair of shoes today, you are benefiting from centuries of trial, error, and awakening. You are living proof that empathy outlasts cruelty, that awareness can transform tradition, that freedom can begin in the smallest gesture. So perhaps the story of Victorian shoes is not just about feet, or fashion, or history. It is about all the invisible ways we learn to walk differently, as individuals, as societies, as a species. It reminds us that evolution is not only about invention, but about intention, about choosing to make the world softer, kinder, more humane. Every generation faces its own version of the Victorian shoe, some pressure to conform, some ideal that asks us to hurt for acceptance, and every generation must learn again that comfort is not complacency. It is courage. To walk comfortably in one's own truth is the quietest, most powerful rebellion of all. Because progress is not about walking faster, it is about walking freer. And that is the true ending of this story, a journey from suffering to awareness, from conformity to compassion, from polished pain to quiet peace. We began with a world where beauty was a cage. We end with one where beauty can finally breathe. So, the next time you lace up your shoes, whether they are worn, polished, or brand new, take a moment to appreciate what they represent. They are not just protection for your feet. They are symbols of empathy made tangible, history made comfortable, humanity made visible. They carry the memory of every person who ever dared to ask, "Why must we hurt to belong?" and the triumph of every person who decided to walk differently. Each step you take today is built on their courage, and as long as we keep walking kindly, consciously, comfortably, we honor them, because the story of the Victorian shoe, in the end, is the story of us all, how we learn to stop enduring and start living. And that brings us to the end of our walk through history. From the cobblestone streets of Victorian London to the quiet comfort of our modern shoes, we have seen how something as ordinary as footwear can tell an extraordinary story, one about pride, pain, endurance, and finally, empathy. If there is one thing to take away from this journey, it is that progress is not measured by how perfect we look, but by how peacefully we live. Every generation inherits some form of discomfort, a tradition, an expectation, a narrow shoe that does not quite fit. And every generation has the chance to loosen the laces a little, to make life softer for those who come next. So as you take your next steps, wherever they lead, remember that comfort is not weakness, it is wisdom. It means you have learned from the past. It means you have chosen freedom over fear, kindness over conformity. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten corners of history, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more people find these quiet lessons from the past. Take care of your feet, take care of your steps, and most of all, take care of yourself. Until next time, keep walking gently through the world.